Some of the people that we were talking to, I'm doing it working on dispatch now, which is about the 47th Brigade. It's one of the kind of elite brigades. It was equipped with Western equipment. They've got Bradley fighting vehicles, and the dispatch is about how effective these vehicles are. Even they were designed in the 1970s, 80s, and they're still effective against FPV drones today, which is a threat that they probably never expected to face. But some of those crews, we were speaking to them, and I would say, how is the situation here? And it's near Rodivka, which is another place that Russians are trying to push. How is the situation now? And they say it's more or less calm. And we're sitting there, we can hear like cluster munitions coming in, there's multiple launch rocket systems coming in, like Bradleys are calling in that they've been hit or by an FPV drone strike. And for them, this is relative calm because they've been in the Zaporizhia counteroffensive, they were fighting in Avdiivka. But that's a bad situation for your troops to be in. If your troops are so tired that they think it's calm and it's normal when you're being hit with artillery to that degree, then they're not going to react quickly enough to threats. So they're not going to get on the deck. Some of them won't wear body armor anymore because it's so hot here. That's a dangerous point. You want troops who are, that know the positions they're in. The ideal point is when they're quite familiarized with the positions they're in, maybe like a month, 2 weeks in, but are still alert to the dangers that they face, taking cover where they need to take cover. One of those crews, they were very casual when we visited them, and they said it wasn't really a dangerous place. And we went back to the command center and spent some time with the commander of that battalion. And then, 5 minutes later, they were calling in that they were being targeted by 152 millimeter artillery. So, they were still in a very dangerous place, and they were not really thinking that it was dangerous. The Black Sea is essential for Ukraine's economy. They need to be able to use those sea routes to export grain, to import the vital foodstuffs and other things into Ukraine. And they have managed to do that. I mean, it's very impressive that the Ukrainian Navy have been completely outgunned, and so many more ships in the Russian Black Fleet. The Ukrainian Navy, together with Ukrainian military intelligence and Ukraine State Security Service, have struck so many Russian vessels in the Black Sea that they are combined to ports not only in Crimea, because there have been strikes inside ports in Crimea as well, but more often way over to the Russian side of the coast. And that has allowed ships to operate through this kind of unilateral grain corridor that Ukraine has created. That's really important. But there's also a sense, that Ukraine could really manage to isolate Crimea and make it difficult for the Russians to keep their bases there. And that's very important because as long as you have Russian air bases on Crimea, it offers the opportunity to strike anywhere on the south of Ukraine and even deeper. And it's another direction that you have to defend against with your kind of limited air defense capabilities. And so isolating the Russians there, making sure they can't get supplies across the Kerch Bridge, making sure that ships can't resupply those areas is going to be really crucial to the Ukrainian warfare. It's one of the few areas that we've seen success and optimism in the last year.
I mean, the Kerch Bridge, when you talk about isolating Crimea, is the Kerch Bridge the key?
The Kerch Bridge is hugely important, and the rail link there is really important. We've seen Ukrainian attempts to bring that down, so, with some success. I think the question is, when is the most strategic time for them to do that? What missiles are they using? Every time that they use kind of Storm Shadows, the Russians learn a bit more about them. If they use other kinds of missiles, the Russians will learn a bit more about them. So they don't have so many, and more importantly, more crucially, they don't have so many jets to use the Storm Shadows. They run quite low on those jets that they need. So I think we can expect more attacks on the Kerch Bridge. The Russians are trying to defend it more effectively. Drones have adapted. There were some drone strikes on the Kerch Bridge, which also damaged it. But I think there will be a point when the Ukrainians will be trying to hit that bridge hard and disable it. And it just depends on where they can apply their resources at any one point in the section. It's such a big front line. You're thinking about Kharkiv all the way down to the Kherson region. It's just an enormous front line you have to defend, and if you're going to have a kind of offensive operation like the kind you would need to disable the Kerch Bridge and then capitalize on it by striking the Russians at Crimea. Because if you disable the Kerch Bridge but you don't do much about the Russian bases on Crimea, there's not much point. You have to do both of those things at the same time. So they need to concentrate forces. It's very difficult for them now when they have manpower shortages. And they're still reporting, delays in Western weaponry. A lot of the brigades in Donbass said, we haven't had anything out. One guy said we've had 4 Mark 19 automatic grenade launchers since the 60 billion package, and that's it for an entire brigade. And he thinks maybe that's because a lot of it has been shipped to Kharkiv because that was the most pressing need initially. But it's very, very slow going, and it doesn't come in huge amounts. Some of that is because of production difficulties in the West, but also a lot of it is just political will.
And another area where we've seen Ukraine having success is also drone strikes on places like Rostov Oblast inside Russia. How significant would you say that is?
It's huge. I mean, taking the war to Russia is a really, really important part. Ukraine cannot just fight a defensive war when all of its infrastructure is being torn apart and it's not able to hit Russian infrastructure. And the things that are allowing Russia to wage war effectively, the oil depots, the kind of munitions factories, things like that, deep inside Russia, Ukraine needs to be able to strike those. And obviously the UK has been helpful recently and realistic and practical in saying, yes, you can use our munitions to strike targets inside Russia, military targets inside Russia. It's very strange that the US still says we're limiting the way that we use our weapons, forcing Ukraine to fight a kind of very one-sided war. But Ukraine anyway has been adapting to developing its own drones. We've seen some of these long-range strikes are very innovative. They just kind of bought kind of Italian kit planes, put them together, put kind of different hardware and software in order to remote guide it, and then strike very, very long distances inside Russia where the Russians weren't expecting it. But as everything with this war, when you start doing something that's new, the enemy tries to adapt to it and will discover how you're doing it and find new ways of stopping it. So the Russians will see now that they're using these kit planes, they kind of will have an idea of what kind of range they can reach, and try and install their defenses to stop that happening. I mean, it's still effective because it stretches Russian resources more thinly, and I think the Ukrainians, will be developing more drone capabilities that can have these longer range strikes and are very effective. Just today we saw an oil refinery in Russia was hit, and that will have an impact on the Russian war effort.
Just finally, Maxim, you've obviously reported from Ukraine a lot over recent years. From your conversations this time around, sum up, if you can, the general mood amongst Ukrainian troops about where they think the war is at the moment and what the state of play is.
I think the main talking point in the trenches has really been what's going to happen with the US elections. Is that going to just totally undo us? Because if US aid stops, this war is unwinnable. They will continue to defend and continue to fight, but it just takes away any kind of hopes of what will Trump do if he's elected. What's happening with Biden? Why is he still running when he's obviously had so many gaffes? They're really, really worried about this. What will the future like without US support? And I think that there is not that sense of optimism certainly that we had before the summer counteroffensive last year. There's not we talked about plans of something similar like that. You ask them is it even possible that Ukraine could mount a counteroffensive? Do you have the resources to do that? Every brigade says there's no way that we could mount a counteroffensive now. It's just going to be a defensive war for the foreseeable future. And obviously that could change if political decision making change, and the US decided we'll give Ukraine what it wants, when it wants, and in the numbers that it wants. But for now, it's a kind of, we're holding on, we're still determined, but we don't see how this is going to end or when this is going to end.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.